Okay, so welcome back. We're going to quickly take a look at some of the more simple rigging options that you can come up with once you've gotten through to this stage. So, following on from the previous two videos, now this is not how I plan on rigging this character. I plan on doing a full custom rig on this character, but let's say you get to this stage and you need something quick that will suffice. We've gone through, we've placed our joints, we've done our orientations on these joints, and now we've done our skin weighting, at least on part of this mesh. From here, we can use the HumanIK in order to give us a usable rig on characters that are at least reasonably humanoid. So we're going to go through and have a quick look at the steps on how you would do that with a custom joint chain. So this is not the standard default joint chain. These are my own custom joints with my own custom names that I can use for whatever else I like. So in order to get a custom rig onto our custom joints, we're going to go through and create a character definition. So I'm going to come to my HumanIK toggle over here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a character definition. I'm going to rename this character definition, and I'm going to call this Dulcindius Control Rig Def. There we are. I've got my name for this now, and from here it's a simple matter of going through and assigning the equivalents for all of the points in here. So I'm going to go through and do that. I'll try and get through it relatively quickly. Now, it's worth noting some joints will be omitted from this procedure. Now, I've made certain joint choices on this rig for my own custom rigging method. But just because you have custom joints on there doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to work in here. We just may need to omit the odd bit of data. So we'll start by choosing the hip joint. In this case, this is usually the root joint. So I select my root joint, right click, assign selected. I'm now going to select my leg, also mask my mesh. So it makes this task a little easier. Right click, assign bone, next joint, assign, next joint, assign. I'm going to come into the foot, and I'm going to just assign this to the toe joint there. Okay, we'll come back up. And we'll go into our spine. So my first spine joint is this one. Now I'm omitting this joint. This is my hip swing joint that I'll use to control the hips later on when I go do my custom rig. But for now, we'll just go through and we'll omit that joint. So I'm going to assign that joint. I'm going to come in here to my spine section, go to my next one, assign, go to my main torso joint and assign. Then I'm going to leave this section, and I'm going to omit this joint here. This is my end effector for my torso, but I'm going to omit this joint and move on to this next joint, which is the first neck joint. So we're going to assign that, we're going to assign that, and we're going to assign that, and then we leave this area and we come to this joint. This joint will be our head joint. Select my clavicle, assign, come down to the wrists, and we'll assign the wrists. I can go in and assign the fingers as well. Now it will present an error here that the arm is not aligned to the x-axis, but for the sake of creating a control rig on a character, we can go ahead and ignore this. for the time being, as we're not going to be applying motion capture data to this character at the moment. And even if we were, we could always adjust the offsets ourselves. Hence why it's a warning and not a stop. You can't go further. Assign that. And there we go. We now have all these assigned. We've got a warning up here telling us that the arm doesn't seem to be parallel to the x-axis, and I don't care. From here, I can come straight across to this little button here to create control rig. When I press this button, it's going to create a rig for my character. Now, it's not the most amazing rig in the world to use this. This is a perfectly acceptable rig for quickly posing a character, or if you just want to get some mocap data onto your character quickly, and you don't care too much about quality or standards, this will cut the cheese. So as we can see from here, we can go and we can start selecting these controls and moving them. Now, a few things that are worth noting here. I'm going to press the up button on this. These controls here, if you want to adjust how this rig is used, you have the ability to control all of these points here. When the point is in green, that is indicating that that control is essentially in some loose form of IK mode, or inverse kinematic mode, where the preceding joint is controlled inversely from the joint before it, giving you this kind of effect. Only this is not exactly in IK mode. Now, if I want to change this into IK mode, we can come down to this section down here. We click on one of these beads, and then we set the IK blend T and IK blend R both to on, and then technically this joint will be in IK mode. So if I was to grab the torso from here and rotate, my hand would stay still. If we want it to be in FK mode, we can come and grab that again, turn these both off, and now the arm will be in FK mode. It's worth noting that the FK mode is some kind of odd blend between IK and FK, where you get a little bit of the best of both worlds. You can sort of place your hand efficiently, but at the same time you can also rotate your controls. Now, it's worth noting that no matter what you do in terms of your orientations, your orientations on your joints are going to be not great. Your controls are non-zeroable as well, which is worth considering. And the way that you reset your character when you're using the human control rig, HumanIK, if you take note, if I grab my move tool and I set all my translates and rotates to 0 like you would on a normal rig, sorry, I'll grab those and 0 them out, that's not going to reset that control. In order to reset this control, I need to right click on the control and go to stance pose, and that will put that control back into its original default position. And we have to do that on all of our controls when we want to reset our character. And that's the basics of the HumanIK rig. So we can select our joints and we can select our controls and we can move them. We can change whether we are working with IK or FK simply by selecting these points and changing these sliders. And this has essentially changed that type of controller. Now again, if I zero that out, that's going to go to my world 0, which is up here for this character for the moment. And again, if you want to reset the controllers on the HumanIK, you don't zero out like you would do on any normal good quality rig. you right click on these controls and use a stance pose. Okay, now that I've flung enough shade to this shitty rigging technique, what we're going to do is just quickly have a look at how we go about adding things to this rig. Now the process is relatively simple. So in this particular case, because I'm using my own custom joint chain, those joints are being driven. So I went through and created a jawbone and all of the normal joints that I needed to have. I weight painted them, make sure my weight painting was up to scratch, and from there, when I use this control rig, all of those joints are actually still driving my character. But let's say I wanted to add something for some reason. Again, just reset stance pose. Let's say I wanted to add something. So I'm going to pretend for a second my character has a tail. I'm going to pretend that there's mesh out here for a tail. If I wanted to add that tail, I would create joints along the span of that tail. To type in select space dash high to select the hierarchy. Change my joint size to 0.1. And from here, I could do one of a few things. I could use a constraint to hold this joint. I could use a controller to give control over this joint and then hold the controller, or even better, hold a group that controller is in. And by doing that, that would let the control stay clean of data so the animator could still continue using it. So I'll go ahead and sort of quickly show that now. So as currently, these joints are just sitting here free floating. They're not doing anything. We've just added a joint chain. I'll go through and quickly name them so we can see what these represent. Tail A, tail B, tail C, and tail D. Okay, we have our tail joints for our imaginary tail. From this point, what I would want to do is I'd want to connect it to my control rig first, and then once it's connected, I would then be free to add these joints as an influence into my skin cluster. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. Okay, so for now we can sit here and go, okay, how do we best control this section of joints? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my normal skeleton, and in this case here, my normal skeleton, I have a root joint up here. Now, ideally, the tail should be derived from that root joint, which is roughly approximate to where you would expect the tail to be. Now, if in your case the tail is somewhere else, let's say, for example, as silly as this might be, maybe the tail came out from the middle of the back. If that was the case, and you expected the tail to move more in line with how the torso moves, then potentially you would come up the chain to maybe spine C. And in this case, we could parent this joint underneath spine C. So what I'm going to do in this case is this section of joints, I'm going to parent this under the root joint directly. So I'm going to select this joint, then I'm going to control select my root joint, and I'm going to press P. That's going to connect that to my root joint directly. So now if I go and grab my character and move it, the whole tail will move along with that character. Okay, so now that we've got that done, we need to come up with some controls to be able to control this with. So whenever I'm making controls, I have a method that I generally tend to follow. Sorry, that's right, you can't zero these out. So stance pose, that is. There we go. Okay, so whenever I'm making a control, I generally adhere to this process. And I'll go through this relatively quickly. As let's say we create controller. That's going to create a controller at world 0. For me, my world 0 is up here, which is not ideal. I will admit my character should be up with his feet on the world 0 point. but I just haven't got to that stage yet. So we'll get to there in a minute. Okay, so I have a controller here. I'm going to scale it down a little bit. I'm going to freeze its transforms, which will clean out its scale data back to 1 again. So these return to 1. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to group this control twice. I'll first name it. So this is going to be tail underscore A underscore control. Now that I've named it, I'm going to press Control G and Control G again. It's going to put 2 groups onto this controller. And there's a reason that we have 2 groups instead of 1 group. You can get away with 1 group, but having 2 groups gives you access to a nice little feature when it comes to your SDKs, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So the 2 groups are going to be called tail underscore A underscore xform. The next group is going to be called tail underscore A underscore SDK. Okay. Now, people will have their own versions of this language. As you know, some people might call this offset. Some people call the SDK one offset. But what's important to note is that the first group is going to hold all of our transform data. And the reason that it's going to have that transform data is to show the... One second. Okay, sorry, I'm back. Yes, so where were we? Yeah, so I have on this control a controller with 1 group and 2 groups. All of these are set to world 0. So I make my control, make sure it's at world 0, freeze its transforms, and then apply 2 groups to it by pressing Control and G. One's named xform, one's named SDK. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the xform group of this controller. I'm then going to shift select the joint in which I want this joint to control. I'm then going to press P to parent them. I'm going to zero out this data from translate X to the rotate Z. I'm then going to press Shift P to unparent that group again. So what we've done is we've parented the xform group to the joint. Once we made that parent, this controller then inherited the offset of this joint from its world 0 position. We have then cleared out that data in order to move this controller to the same location and orientation as the joint, and then we've unparented it. And by doing so, we have stolen the transform and rotation data of that joint in that location. And so now I have a controller located here. This controller has the same orientation as my joint, but it has no data on the control. I have an SDK group that I can then go and use later to create custom poses that the animator can activate quickly. And I have an xform group that has all of the translate and rotation data that is allowing this controller to inherit the orientation of this joint. Now, one small caveat to this is that the rotation of this controller is not in the rotation that I would like to control this joint. So I'm going to adjust that, but I'm going to adjust that at the vertex level, or the control point level in this case for a curve. So I'm going to press Control 1, right click and hold, Control Vertex, and I'm going to select these components. With those components selected, I'm going to press Control 1 again, grab my rotation tool, and in here I'm going to hold in the J key and rotate on the Z axis until my controller is aligned and snapped to the orientation of that joint. From there, I will scale down that selection as well until, again, imagining I have a tail going through this area, this should be sort of just going outside this shape. And from here, you can move and change the shape of these points to better conform to the shape that you have here. If you want a more complicated shape, you can either make the shape initially to start with and then rotate it into position at the control vertex level once it's been placed, or you can craft it around the shape once you've moved it to the position. From here, I'm going to go back to object mode, and I have a control here called control A Xform. Now this control, the Xform group, is in world space again. So if I was to zero out all of this data here, that would put this controller back at world 0, where it originally was. And that means that the controller is in world space. Now I don't want to freeze this transformation. I want to leave this data on this curve, or on this group, sorry, because this is going to allow my curve to keep its orientation. But because it's in world space, the process of creating a new controller for a new joint is very simple. All I have to do, close the group, press Ctrl D, shift select the next joint, and we rinse and repeat. P, 0, shift P. Now I have a new joint in a new location, and all I have to do is go and rename the A to B. And we can rinse and repeat again. So from this time, Control D, select the destination, P, 0, shift P, and rename the controls. And there we have it. We have our 3 controls in the location with their Xform groups holding the data, and our curves all zeroed out. From here, we can set up just a simple FK chain. So in order to do that, I'm going to open all these up, and each curve is going to be the parent of the control group below it. So in this case, I'm going to take my transform C, or my tail C, and the tail B is going to be the parent of that Xform group. So I'm going to middle mouse drag that to there. Open everything back up again so we can see what's going on. And again, we're going to do the same thing again from the B Xform group to the tail A control. From here to here. Then I can open all that up. And what I should have is I should have a tail Xform group that is the parent of all the other groups underneath it, with this group controlling all of the controllers, this one controlling the last 2, and this one controlling nothing. All of our data is still clean and zeroed, and our hierarchy should look like this: 2 groups and a curve, followed by 2 groups and a curve, and 2 groups and a curve, and so on, for however many controllers you have in the chain. In order to get this to control our joints, all we have to do now is select our control, shift select our joint, and we can constrain parent, and in this case we don't need to maintain offset because we have ensured that our controller and our joint have the same orientations. So we can turn that off and press apply. And we rinse and repeat that down the chain. This joint, this controller to this joint, apply, and this controller to this joint, and apply. Now we have our controls. Move the tail, like so. We have no offsets between our controllers and our joints, so we should get no flipping on the joints when the rotations approach 180 degrees or 360 degrees. And we should be able to select all three and have nice, clean rotations on them. Now, one last problem to deal with. If we select our character and we're going to move him now, the tail doesn't move with the group. So what we're going to do here is we have some choices. In this case, I'm going to let the root joint of my skeleton control this joint in much the same way as we've got this one being controlled by this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate or find my root joint, hide some of these joint chains. Here is my root joint, and I want this control chain to be controlled by that root joint. So I'm going to middle mouse drag this from here to here. That's going to make that root joint the parent of that series of controls. So now when I move this and it moves my root joint, my tail will follow with my rig. I can still go through and animate on these joints. All right, and we'll leave that there for now. So that's essentially how you can make custom controllers and how you can add them to your character, or at the very least very simple controllers. The same thing can be done with IK chains and spline IKs and a whole series of other things, and we'll cover those in due course. But for now, this should give you all the tools that you need to make a basic series of controllers to control anything from a tail to an extra bit of cloth hanging off your character, to antennas, all sorts of things. Alright, okay, thanks for watching.